Good afternoon, everyone. This is just a friendly reminder that we're going to get started in 2 minutes.
So I'm always trying to remember where I come from and who I am, because I'm a pretty damn eccentric person. But before this, I'm just trying to be my most professional self and utilize this wealth of knowledge I've collected. But before this, I'm just a busybody, always playing rhythms with my feet so that everywhere I go is a dance. Always singing a song so that my journey is a jam sesh. I am a soulful, big bone swing band. But before this, I'm just an hermano, preoccupied with my baby sister's laughter, making sure that she's cackling Mexicana milagrosa. But before this, I am a queer, built of the seer bones and epitomes of Spartans, who started wars only after they made love to each other. Because to them, a wife's kindness wasn't exactly battle ready, but a comrade's devotion sure as hell was legendary. But before this, I'm just the kitchen table inside of everyone's hearts. How we nourish each other with the food from the oven, shoving all the Sunday fun day into our belly. I love peanut butter and jelly, because it's one of the closest memories I have of me and my nephew in that sticky mash of summer cartoons. But before this, I am Latino. Explico that I'm a chico niño, still too young to understand why I can't be loud in Spanish, why I'm best tolerated in English, before people like Trump try to tell me that I am a criminal, with all the will to demoralize the fabric of American values. Setback told we plagiarized our identity, but he has never read my ancestors' codices. This, y'all, is how poison seeds get planted in both kids and me, and my parents, and the elders. We, a whole forest of rob trees, hacked and uprooted, but before this I'm saluted for a flexible tongue, shunned when I talk bilingual, as if a single one language can explain while we still use race as a target. But let's go ahead and get far from this, to a time when we didn't have laws to obey that were meant to keep us enslaved, sovereign of the laws of white men who never intend to get off the podium, as pandemonium makes us forget exactly how far we've come, because before this, I was the Raramuri races in my great-grandmother's maternal mountains. I was a Spanish maternal blood my great-grandfather released like the running of the bulls. But even before this, I was just Cro-Magnon, standing up against a whole mammoth, with nothing but my spear, my kin, believing we would win. But even before this, I was Australopithecus. See how many of you can actually make sense of this. As a species, we stood up, lost our footing, always putting our feet in our mouths. Didn't we notice the sounds that we make? How racial slurs actually sound like a rattlesnake on the ground? Did you just ignore the caution to think think before talking, to look before walking. Have we forgotten the caves we crawled in? Because before this, we were human prey, so instead, we prayed. We who know how to make good with our magic. Tragic how we forgot the gods within, how to turn pain and lust into faith and trust. We who burned all the Palo Santo wood. Because before this, we just withstood whatever this world to try to hurl at our face with this pace like it's trying to kill me and all of my siblings. But even before this, I know I was just God's tear, sent down right here. This is the language of turmoil. We who turn the soil in our poems to plant the seeds to make the oxygen we breathe. So before this, I am a wind mystic. Before this, I'm not going to give myself over to stories that ignore me. I have always been this big. I have always navigated myself. Typhoon. I have not and will not forget that I've always been a monolith. So before this, I just had to tell you that I know the risk and the stakes of losing this. So I cradle this. Because before this, I'm just trying to understand where I come from and who I am from myself.
Thank you, Franklin. Thank you for bringing our culture, our enormity, our complexity, our specificity, our beauty into this closing session. Thank you for lifting up identity, intersectionality, our humanity, our vision, and our destiny. And all of this together is actually the perfect segue into the conversation we're going to have this afternoon. So before I have the honor and privilege of introducing Jeff Chang, I want to take a quick minute to connect a few themes from yesterday and the plenary this morning. By the way, if you appreciated both the content from this morning and walked away with some compelling lessons, in addition to Franklin's opening, please join me in giving our morning speakers and Franklin another round of applause. So I will share briefly that there were powerful kernels of wisdom to take away from yesterday and today that when coupled with some of the pathway strategies that were identified in our breakout sessions, together they can help inform our work back home while also setting the context for this next conversation. So Shakima, in her infinite wisdom, shared with us this morning one of the most salient comments I think I've heard for quite some time that had real resonance to inform how we work with our young people about the power and importance of each of us owning our own narrative. Franklin and Shakima beautifully reminded us of the power in our journey, and even more critically, how it relates back to Sean's message, that the ownership of our journey, our stories, better informs how we show up for the young people that we love and care for so deeply. Because see, what we were reminded of is that we're not just storytelling. Our stories have both a purpose and a responsibility. And we must use them productively for the sake of the vision that we all hold. This harkens back to Shanice. Yesterday, sharing with us her own journey as a youth leader to now one of the most powerful advocates for young people on the national stage, and how as she continues to use her own power, walk into her own power, she too can show up to better support her peers and young leaders as they make their way on their own journey. Sean's call to action, to not just suppress symptoms and cope, but to be really clear about the vision we create. See, this connected deeply. And for those of you who may have been with us when we convened in Boston last year, you may remember that it was Deval Patrick, former governor of Massachusetts, who reminded us that it's not enough to be clear about what we don't want. It is even more critical that we are clear about what it is that we want in this fight for equity and justice. And he was joined by Hillary Pennington, who also asked this really important question, the question that I think about daily in this work. That question is, particularly I should say when we are hounded by these national messages daily, the question is, which wolf are we going to feed? And so to Carlos' point about how critical it is that we must believe fundamentally that all people are inherently good, it feels right. It feels right and promising, and I'm so thankful Sean reminded us this morning that we must construct and build our strategies based on our hopes, based on our visions, and based on the transformation we want to see for this world. Sean also said the most fundamental work of the healing movement is to transform systems so that young people are seen in their full humanity. I want you all to pause. Just pause and take a moment to think about what it would look like if our world achieved the goal of every young person, black, brown, white, poor, middle class, no matter your background, where you come from, if every child could be seen in their full humanity. What I appreciated about this is that it tied almost artfully to Dan Porterfield's call. And see, he talked about an asset-based frame with our youth-led change work. I want to be clear. I do believe in an asset-based frame. At the same time, while I think an asset-based frame is necessary, I know that it is not sufficient. In fact, Dan's call for the preferential option for youth, this notion that our most fundamental work together is to put the needs of our young people first and foremost in our society, just completely, in my mind, connected deeply with what Sean's call to our network was this morning, particularly as we focus on both youth and community power building. And finally, to tie all of this explicitly into our conversation with Jeff, Judith, Pham and Ryan, there was so much talk about culture. La cultura cura, the culture that cures and restores our identity. Cheryl reminded us that when culture is left out of our systems, they cannot function because it is a key ingredient to restoring and seeking the system change that we want to achieve with our work. These references to culture are important because they tie to what we've asked Jeff to come here and speak about today, particularly culture, including helping us to define what it means, Jeff, so that we all have a shared understanding of what we mean when we use this language, and then also narrative change as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Jeff Chang. Now, usually I would not read the entire bio of our keynote speaker, but see, Jeff's background is so impressive, it feels actually critical to the context setting for this next discussion. And I do know it's in your materials, but I'm just going to take an extra minute to tell you a little bit about Jeff. So Jeff has written extensively on culture, politics, the arts, and music. His first book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip-Hop Generation, garnered many honors, including the American Book Award and the Asian American Literary Award. He edited the book Total Chaos, The Art and Aesthetics of Hip-Hop. Jeff's book, Who We Be, A Cultural History of Race in Post-Civil Rights America, won the Ray and Pat Brown Award for Best Work in Popular Culture and American Culture, and was a finalist for the NAACP Vision Award, Image Award, the Dayton Library Peace Prize, and Books for a Better Life Award. His latest book that we shared with our network at this convening, We Gon Be Alright, Notes on Race Resegregation, was published in 2016. It was named the Northern California Nonfiction Book of the Year, and the Washington Post declared it the smartest book of the year. Jeff's next project is a biography on Bruce Lee. Come on, somebody. I said a biography on Bruce Lee. Now, Jeff has been a USA Ford Fellow in Literature and a winner of the North Star News Prize. I can go on, but I think you're starting to get the sense here of not just his accomplishments, but maybe most critically, his intellectual leadership, the way that he is helping us make sense, meaning, and understanding, not just of our history, but how we bring them into our current times to realize and manage the complexity of what our country is going through. So that's a lot about what Jeff has achieved. Here's what I want to tell you personally about Jeff. He is the foremost artist and expert on hip-hop culture, race, narrative change, cultural strategy, and organizing, especially for youth-led change. I do think he is one of the most extraordinary intellectual leaders of our time. Most critically, however, In working together to get to our convening today, he was consistently kind, consistently humble, consistently gracious, and so generous with his time and his expertise. So by the way, if I sound like I have an intellectual crush on Jeff, it's because I do. And so does our entire team, by the way, just keeping it 100. And without further ado, I want to welcome Jeff to the stage. Please join me.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much, Monique. This is my first time to the Aspen Institute, to Opportunity Youth gathering, but I feel right at home. Listening to folks this morning from Bianca's poem on emergence, Dr. G talking about healing, Cheryl and Shakima and Carlos elaborating that, building that out, I just feel right at home. I want to send a thank you, a deep shout of gratitude to the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, especially to Monique and to Sherry for the kind invitation, and also to the staff who've been working really, really hard to make sure that we're well fed. Yes, give it up, let's please. That we're comfortable, that we sound good, that we can do our presentations. Thank you so much to all the staff for doing all your hard work. So I wrote this book. It's called We Gon Be Alright. And the first thing to know is that I wrote it and it was published before the 2016 election, hence the title. And the book was about the ways in which we, as a nation, have failed to maintain, to keep up, and to let, instead, be dismantled a lot of the structures that we set up over the last 50 years to try to bring us to greater racial equity, greater racial justice. And I have to admit to you that it's been hard for me to be able to go out and talk about a book called We Gon Be Alright, when every week, especially this past month, has felt so much like we probably aren't going to be. But I take heart in the song originally that gave this book its title, right? Kendrick Lamar's All Right, where he's expressing his trauma as a young black man growing up in South Los Angeles for most of the song. If you did a quantitative analysis of the lyrics, right, I'd say probably about 80% of the lyrics are trauma-related, right? But then he gets to the chorus, and he seems to pull it out of a hat almost, right? If God's got us, meaning if you've got me, if I've got you, if we've got each other, then we're going to be all right. And it's this sort of leap of imagination, right? This sort of dash of hopeful energy that he offers us in this. And it's a reminder that the power of our imagination is greater than all the power that's aligned against us, right? That the power of our imagination can take us through to a better day. And so let's start right at the beginning, right? Which is knowing that we're in this moment. I kept on pressing the laser, but I found the right button. We're in this moment where we're more polarized than we've ever been historically, except for maybe the Civil War, right? We're living in an era of culture wars. And the culture wars are, in a sense, a struggle over competing narratives. On the one hand, a narrative of an America that's in danger of being lost forever, right? An America that needs to be restored, that needs to be made great again because of all of the demographic and cultural changes that have swept through it, right? The America that's being evoked in this angry defense of whiteness and white supremacy, right? And on the other hand, a narrative of the America that, to paraphrase Langston Hughes, is not yet been. The America that we want to make. Because by all rights, we should be despairing, right? We should, because of our history, be hopeless. And yet, again and again, we stand up, we dare to struggle, We dare to hope and we dare to fight for this America that might yet be, right? A great America, a transformative America that might meet its highest promise. And so there's these two competing narratives in the culture wars. And add to all of that, the specter, the looming specter of 2042, right? This is a year, right? The year that it all goes to hell, right? The year in which the U.S. becomes a quote-unquote majority minority, right? In 2023, we're going to pass that point for all Americans under the age of 18. In 2042, we're going to reach that point for all Americans, period. And so this brings us to probably the most important question of our time, and certainly for the youth who are coming of age right now, right? If we are all minorities, how do we begin to imagine a new majority? And right now, of course, political parties are spending billions of dollars trying to resolve this kind of question in their own kind of a way. But I'd argue that it's more of a cultural question, right? What are the values that we're going to move forward upon? How will we be able to make a country in which we are all free? And the culture is where that work is going to happen. And so let's go back to this quote from Abe Lincoln, who knew a little bit about divided culture, a divided country. He said, "Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes and decisions possible or impossible to be executed," right? He was talking about the culture, right? And what he was saying is that culture moves before politics, right? The imagination for change must be there, that culture moves before policy. We have to have the imagination for the kind of change that we want to make, the kind of country that we want to make, embedded in the massive social space, right, amongst millions of people before we can imagine policy and political change. Now, a lot of change needs to be made. The thing that we've been left in over the last 50 years is resegregation, right? And so we see it, for instance, here in my home area, the San Francisco Bay Area, which in some ways is ground zero for a lot of these discussions around gentrification. What we know is that the past 50 years have left us at this point. This is now the racial income gap in San Francisco. And displacement has a domino effect, right? And so if San Francisco has become unaffordable, then Oakland, people move to Oakland, and Oakland is now becoming unaffordable. And people need to move from Oakland to Antioch. What we know is also that the homelessness rate in Oakland has grown by 39% over the past 2 years. So gentrification itself is too small a frame to understand what's really actually happening in our cities all across the country. Gentrification, right? Look at the word, gentrification. It centers the money that's moving into the city, but it disappears the people who are being forced out, right? And so gentrification is just a small part of a larger thing that's going on, and that's resegregation. And we see it happening in our schools. Our young are, of course, the most diverse generation that the U.S. has ever seen. And yet they're growing up now in a country that's more desegregated than it has been in the last 50 years. The peak of desegregation in schools came in 1989. And in 2010, 70% of Latinx and 74%, or 80% of Latinx and 74% of Black K-12 students attended majority non-white schools. The average white student attended a school that was 75% white. And what's the final impact of all of this racial inequity? Well, we go to the most important metric, the most important number of all, the fundamental question of life expectancy. And these are the latest numbers that we have for life expectancy. The long-term impact of inequity is that in general, Native people and African Americans live shorter lives than other groups. And this is what we mean when we say Native lives matter. This is what we mean when we say Black lives matter. Now, we live in a moment where politics feels broken. We have a system that brings us no justice and no peace. We feel alone. We feel isolated, bound by this hopeless reality. Politics is actually not rising to meet our ideals. 2/3 of Americans believe that there should be gun control. 2/3 believe that dreamers should not be deported. 2/3 believe that the country is divided and headed in the wrong direction. Yet politics continues to push us apart. It's about a world in which there's no pretense of higher virtues, only of power, and a cycle of harm and revenge, a world segregated and at war. And here's where we're just repeating and echoing some of the themes that were raised this morning by Bianca and by Dr. G, right? And so we intervene in the culture to change people's imagination of what can be achieved. Half a century ago, there was at least a consensus that our country needed to deal with racial equity and racial justice, that we owed it to each other to bring about racial equity and racial justice. So Dr. G talks about healing. We can relate that to justice, right? That people be made whole again. And Martin Luther King put it best in his letter from a Birmingham jail, right? He said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." In other words, until we all are free, none of us is free, right? Democracy is not free. It's an unfulfilled promise. And what King was saying was that even if we had laws on the books, judicial decisions on the books, policies, if people did not recognize our interconnectedness to each other, right? That these laws, these judicial decisions, these policies would eventually still have no teeth, right? And so in the end, it comes down to figuring out the basic question of how we form relations with each other, right? How do we form relations between each other that are not based in domination and exclusion and extraction, but of values that are about exchange and trust and mutuality and intergenerationality. And that's the true meaning of what he was saying when he said that he wanted us to build a beloved community. And to build a beloved community, people first have to believe it's possible. So consider the example of Jackie Robinson, who in 1947 took the field in Dodger Blue. And at that time, the American majority could not imagine an end to Jim Crow segregation. But 7 years later came the Brown versus Board of Education decision. He changed the narrative, and he helped build in many ways a narrative of change that continues to impact us all around the world, right? And so you can think of social movements as end-arounds around politics as usual, right? These are interventions in the culture. These are appeals through the culture. They begun as cultural strategies, calls to the collective imagination, right? So Occupy, right? Or the Dreamers movement, or the March for Our Lives, or the Warriors standing up at Standing Rock, or the protests against the Muslim ban, right? And the most important of these, of course, has been the movement for Black Lives, whose moral imperative has been to try to fight for Black people to be able to be seen in all their difference, all their complexity, all their humanity, echoing again Dr. G's words, right? And if Black people can be seen in all their complexity and humanity, then everyone can potentially be seen in all their complexity and humanity. And we have a chance at building a more open, just, and equal community for all. So all of these movements, all of these justice movements, ask us, what does it mean to dream again? What does it mean to imagine a world in which segregation and violence and war are not the answers but are problems to be solved? And this takes me to the thinking, the work of the late, great Grace Lee Boggs and her ideas about revolution. We often think of revolution as replacing one group in power through bloodshed with another group that's going to take power, right? The violent seizure of power. But Grace said that the next revolution might be better thought of as, quote, advancing humankind to a new stage of consciousness, creativity, and social and political responsibility. So her revolution will require us to move away from finding new ways to divide and rule and consign some people to death, and instead to pivot to life, to honor and transform ourselves and our relationships to each other. She asks that we fundamentally think about how we create our relations to each other, intergenerationally, interculturally, mutually. And so as folks who are striving for community in this moment, we have to choose. We have to choose to stand against the machines of domination, of violence, and of death, to dream of a world beyond what we can currently see. And that's actually our burden, right? All the other side has to do is to reinforce the system as it is, to maintain inequity. We actually have to persuade people, to seduce folks into a vision of a world that has not yet been, right? And so this is the artist Ana Teresa Fernandez at the border that separates Tijuana from San Diego. She's asking us to think about what it means to dream again, to dream of desegregation, to rely upon our powers of imagination to create a better world. And so for those of you who are youth in the audience, right, this is your time. When 2040 comes, you're going to be my age, which is hella old. And so it's upon you, right, working with us, those of us who are older, and working with those of the folks who are not yet born, right, to figure out new visions that will carry us to a world that will be beyond culture wars, that will be about peace and about justice. So the revolution is there for us to make, to imagine and to bring about freedom for all. It's our work to go out and do that. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jeff. We want to transition quickly because we are really eager now to have a conversation that, to Jeff's point, is intergenerational and really reflects multiple perspectives around cultural strategy, narrative change, and maybe most critically, the role our young people are playing in our current movement for equity and justice. Before we have this dialogue, I wanted to introduce our other panelists. So to the left of Jeff, we have Judith Browne Dianis, who is the executive director of the advocacy project, she is the executive director of the Advancement Project. She has an extensive background in civil rights litigation and advocacy, including in the areas of voting, education, policy, housing, and employment. She has protected the rights of people of color in the midst of some of our greatest civil rights challenges of today, including Florida in the 2000 election and also in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. She has also done pioneering work on ending the school-to-prison pipeline. She has supported efforts to secure justice as part of the movement for Black Lives. And I think it's fair to say that she has used her legal background to be a warrior, once again, for some of the most critical human rights issues of our time. Thank you for being here with us, Judith.
Thanks for having me.
To her left is a face you all recognize and love. It is our Kimberly Pham, who is a national activist focused on improving conditions of young people across the country. She's focused on reshaping the narrative of culture and how young people engage in processes for driving positive community change. She's a member of the Project U-Turn Collaborative, so this morning you all got to meet Shakima, who leads PYN. She's a part of that work in Philadelphia, which focuses on learning to produce best practices for opportunity youth in the city of Philadelphia. Two other things about Kim, just to bring texture to the conversation we'll have. She was recently appointed by Mayor Kinney to serve on the education nomination panel to assist with identifying Philadelphia's new local education board. And what I want to make sure I say today on this stage is that it is always an honor and a privilege to sit next to you in any conversation, Kim. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
And last but not least is also a face you may recognize. It's our Ryan Dalton from New Orleans. He has worked with the team in NOLA on the Reconnecting Opportunity Youth Agenda. He is a Cafe Reconcile alumnus and former floor manager and has served as an advisory board member to the John Besh and Bride Mayer Scholarship as Chef's Move. He is a founding member of the National Council of Young Leaders and also Opportunity Youth United. He formerly served on the Youth Ambassador for the Youth Leadership Initiative. And critical to our work that we launched at Aspen, he provided recommendations on the White House Council for Community Solutions report that helped to initially launch our work at the Aspen Institute. Here's what I want to tell you personally about Ryan. I've said this to him off stage, but I also think it's important to set this conversation. His ideas, the work that he has led locally, the presence that he is on the national stage, every time he shows up in a conversation, he not only reflects the very best of what our young people can do and achieve, and maybe most critically, our Black men, he makes space for other young leaders, men of color, to come up behind him. Thank you for being here with us today, Ryan. All right. So my job is to set up this conversation and then get out of the way. And I am really eager to have this dialogue. And in order to really have this dialogue in a fulsome way, I think it's important for you to all know that both Jeff and Judith are friends in the movement. So part of me walking through their bios and background is so that you can hear the intersections and connections that really essentially overlap in all of the work that they have led around equity and justice. And so the first question that I have, noting the common experiences across our panelists, is I actually want to start with Judith, Ryan, and Kim. Just really curious to hear from you. When you think about the work that you have led, and particularly Jeff's comments to our audience today, what resonated with you?
So first, thank you for having me. My first time here at Aspen Institute, so I'm really excited about being here. Took a lot of modes of transportation to get here, but, it's beautiful. So I think just listening to Jeff, the thing that resonated with me is, I think the comment was that culture moves before politics, right? Mm-hmm. So we started Advancement Project with the idea that we were lawyers at another organization, civil rights organization, doing really great work, but what was happening was that the courts were moving to the right. And we were losing. So here I am thinking, I'm going to save the world, free my people, and losing all my cases. And so we decided that we had to have a new model. And that model really was about getting back to what was best about the civil rights movement, was that you had organizing front and center. And that you had organizing, you had communications and narrative shift, right? When you look at the Children's Crusade, right, that march, that was about narrative, right? And then you had the courts, right? And you had very brilliant lawyers, but the lawyers really were following the movement, right? And because the movement had to set the tone and for the way for us to move forward. So even when I think about the nomination of Kavanaugh, I am upset, right? But we're gonna be all right. Because what we are going to be doing is moving the needle with the people. And the people shall win, right? And so for the work that we've done, this is why we set up Advancement Project. We are lawyers, we're communicators, and we're organizers within an organization that works together to support grassroots movements. The biggest thing for us has been, one of the biggest things has been around school to prison pipeline. And I think this work really resonates with what you were saying, was that we, one of the things that we did was, first of all, we kind of come to the work as like Ella Baker-like. We listen to the genius of ordinary people. People who are impacted, know their own circumstances. They actually know how to get out of it. They understand their political realities, and they have some dreams. When you ain't got nothing, one thing you can have is some dreams.
A dream.
And so the people that we work with, we were working with young people. When I say young people, I don't mean like young 18 to 24. I mean young 10 to 18, right? Who were identifying a problem. And we're saying, we're getting kicked out. And so we started off with this idea of we didn't know what zero tolerance was, and we kind of started with that issue around zero tolerance and tried to figure out what the heck is this thing, right? And I'm talking about, this is back when we started Advancement Project in '99. There was no thing called the school to prison pipeline. And it was through movement work that we came to the terminology of school to prison pipeline. We wanted to make zero tolerance a phrase that was a dirty phrase so that school districts would want to get away from it. They'd want to get away from it in terms of their culture, but also in terms of the policy. The culture first and the language first, and then the policy. Then we shifted to movement calling it school to prison pipeline. You know, we had done all this public opinion research. They were like, don't use school to prison pipeline, teachers hate it. And the movement was like, F that. That's what it is. So that's what we're gonna call it. And so we dug in and said, this is what we're gonna call it. And all these years later, now seeing teachers unions, presidents of the United States, well, the old one, not this one. You know, Arnie Duncan, when he's Secretary of Education, I will tell you that it brought tears to my eyes to be on a call with Arnie Duncan saying one thing we don't want to replicate is the school to prison pipeline. And I'm sitting there like, damn, this is good. Because years ago, I remember when we were pushing against you in Chicago. And we were telling you that you had created a school to prison pipeline. And you were like, what, I did? And we were like, yes. And so now you're Secretary of Education and you're stepping back. And so the narrative meant a whole lot in moving and shifting the conversation, but also the policy.
So there are two things I want to say and move the conversation forward that feel so important to pull out, tied to Jeff. Culture first, and then narrative change. And particularly to your point about our movements are fundamentally about identifying what is wrong with our culture and the movement response. The other thing that I want to say that's also tied now to hearing specifically from Kim and Ryan is Ella Baker is one of my most favorite civil rights leaders. In fact, we sort of laughed when you called her out because we named our daughter after Ella Baker. And until the age of 3, if you asked her name, she said Ella Baker. And so what I want to say is that the thing that moved us the most that's tied to so many points you made, is her nickname was Fundi, which is Swahili for the teacher of the next generation, because she was so intentional about starting with young people to build the movement for the change that the civil rights movement was pushing for. And so it feels really important to make that link and the connection because we have our youth leaders sitting beside us today that are helping to do this. So curious to hear from you, Ryan and Kim, what resonated with you?
For me, it was a lot that resonated. Anybody that knows me knows I'm all about the next level, you know, what's next? After they graduate your program, what's next? After they get on their job, what's next? And that's just my aura, right? That's just how I operate. So there's a lot of, I also love quotes. I live my life by quotes. I create quotes and listen to them and follow them if it makes sense to me, right? So there's a lot of quotes that was thrown out there. And one of them was a cycle, it was around a cycle of creating and reproducing toxic, right? I think about that. I think about the system that we're in. I think about just the work that we do, our intention, and then look at the impact, right? And just speaking on that next level of leadership, I do appreciate the focus on that next level, entrepreneurship, on wealth building. Just hearing that in the conversation is so important. How can we end poverty if we don't talk about finances, if we don't understand finances, if we don't understand wealth building, generational wealth, how to start there? If we don't know about redlining, how can we actually end poverty? How can we, really tackle some of these issues, right? First off, without having young people at the table. How can we create a product? How can we create these programs and et cetera without a young person being involved in some type of meaningful way? Not just calling them to the table, but actually making them feel a sense of belonging, which was something else that stuck out to me. It's not just about having a program. It's not just about a number or a participant. It's about having a sense of belonging. Once a young person feel like they belong to something, the barriers fall down. They become vulnerable. It's about exploration. It's about providing opportunities like this for young people. I appreciate the entrepreneurship breakout session. It was adapting entrepreneurship, to the entrepreneurship curricula to just your program. And just all of the focus on just that true empowerment is the important next step for us. We do great work. We have a lot of young people who come through these programs, strive, and do great things. But how do we make this an intentional process? And I think we are embarking on that conversation, and I'm just glad we're at that point right now. So,
Thank you.
For me, there were a few things that were raised. I was in Jeff's session, and he knows that I raised a few ideas. I think something that Ryan just mentioned about like the gentrification thing. I want to speak to like narrative translation and cultural translation, and how do we as a community build? How do we act on deciding what are the values that we want to move on universally? Like, what are the universal values? I think honestly, we all want some respect here, and hopefully that's in our values as we move forward. But just understanding, like, in different communities, there's pockets of culture, and we need to sometimes not assume because there's a particular behavior or certain actions that are being displayed in the community that they're negative, that they're wrong. We are, those folks that we had the opportunity to be on these platforms to talk about narrative and to also highlight other folks' narrative. And it's important that we just don't leave folks in a negative space with stories, because people are going through trials, but they also have triumph. And you hear it throughout the many stories when you talk to young people one-on-one, when you hear it from adults, who are willing to share, their story, that we all go through different trials and stuff. And even for me, having the opportunity to attend the Aspen convening numerous of times, we have changed our culture of how we convene. We don't always now we're not just coming straight to these convenings and sitting down at the table. There's been more art infused into these convenings, so we need to start to pay attention to how we're doing that now and how do we continue to do that. And not just focus in the space of what we're not doing, because we do know we have the power to change what we can do. And it's all based on each one of our actions in this room. And that's how, culture is really, culture happens in community and happens everywhere. It's based on our actions. So honestly, we can move to 2042 and we can tell our people some fictional crap, some stuff that's not really happening, or we could tell them something real, something true that we did try and we are still trying, and hopefully by 2042 that there is a huge transformation that is not just about, young people dropping out of high school, young people having barriers. It's just that we're human. And there's so much that's happening now that we need to acknowledge that. It's not like a traditional mindset. It's not one way to think. It's not one way to do things now. And we need to begin to embrace that there's alternatives to that. And we know that being in this opportunity youth space, that our young people don't have one model that works for them. And sometimes it's not that one opportunity or one program that will work for them. Sometimes they're going through numerous opportunities to really figure out who they are and create who they are in this space. And that's what I think our programs and the work that we do, and going into community, working with different stakeholders, we have to challenge institutions, systems, and folks who lead these spaces to think about the actions that they perpetuate that continue to either create barriers to how young people engage and young people's enrichment when they're in these spaces. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. Sorry, y'all.
Oh, well, so it can be left because you killed it, first of all. And second of all, I just love how almost poetically it was so tied to Dr. G's comments this morning, so eloquently. Jeff, I'm curious if you'd like to respond to what you've heard.
Ooh, there's so much there. Can everybody hear me okay? No? Okay. Better now? Okay. First of all, thank you, Kimberly, because you always have so much stuff going on, and like the stories that you tell, I could sit here and listen to you all day. And thinking about that in relationship to what you're talking about, Ryan, and Judith, what you're talking about in terms of shifting the narrative, one of the things that stood out to me is this notion of difference, right? Allowing people to be who they are, be who they'll be, right? And not judging that, and being able to make sure that folks understand that these are ways of being that are valid. And not just valid, these are the way that people have survived for very, very long periods of time through all of the struggle that we've had to go through. We live in a culture that's really about trying to tear all that kind of stuff away and get us down to say, okay, you got one story, right? You're going to apply to college, you got to tell your one story, right? You're going to get that job, you got to tell your one story, right? You got a shot at making, like whatever, a film, you're going to tell your one story. But what we really need is to be able to hear all the stories at the same time. We live in an era of narrative abundance, and I think that a lot of our old models that are about just telling that one story, they're gone. I mean, daily, right? On social media right now, everybody's telling their story. And the thing that we have to be able to do is to figure out how to marshal those stories to get people to act, right? The stories are really important because they make us feel empathetic. We can start feeling other people's feelings. But empathy is really nothing without action, right? We don't break the cycles, right, until we act. And I think that the shifts are really key, but we have to be able to attach that to action. And that's why I love so much about what you're talking about, because with what you all are doing, what you did with the zero tolerance piece, changing it from this particular narrative of discipline, right, to saying that this is actually criminalization, right? Then that begins to help us understand how a whole bunch of folks are being swept up and policed and criminalized by that particular kind of language, and how it becomes a school-to-prison pipeline. And so forget all those comms models that would have you get on one message that the teachers would be about, right? The people want this. The people want all the stories.
We paid a lot of money for that.
Did you? I'm sure you
and
did.
then threw it out.
Yeah, I know. We could have a whole discussion about how to save money around narrative.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, the people want to be able to hear the stories of what's actually happening to real folks, not just some sort of a stereotype type of picture. And so I think that's where we can start reversing a lot of these trends, is to be able to get our stories out there, build them into narratives, have those narratives attached to action, and that's where I think we see things beginning to change.
So can I just articulate a little bit of a blueprint I just heard Jeff speak to that I'd love to offer to our network. First, I actually want to tie it to having Dan, our president, with us, because he reminded us of Adichie, the danger of a single story, so it's so important to make that connection. But also, most importantly, as we begin to think about a blueprint for youth organizing, here is what I've heard. I've heard that first we need new narratives. We need really complex and diverse narratives that create spaces for our young people to belong, for young people to have meaningful engagement that's tied to their visions for themselves. I heard that the narratives are important because that's where the empathy comes in, and that's where we start to connect across our differences. And then the empathy then moves us to action. We need to make sure we marry our empathy with action to get to the type of social change and vision we hold. So again, it's a little bit of formal, but this is what I'm beginning to hear emerge in ways that feel like they're important for us to consider for our work ahead. So I want to pivot the conversation a little bit, because in our room, we are looking at actually it's probably now about 27 cross-system and cross-sector community collaboratives that, as you know, are working to achieve improved education and employment outcomes for young people who have historically been out of school and out of work. It really is all of the numbers that you lifted up before us, Jeff. So based on the ideas that you all have shared, particularly around culture and narrative change, I'm curious to hear, when you think about, and I love this, mutuality, intergenerationality, how it is we work across the differences that we hold. What advice born out of your work, National Council of Young Leaders, Opportunity Youth United, all of the movements, Judith, that you have been a part of, all of your work, Jeff, what advice would you give to our network as they think about the complexity of cross-sector, cross-system change that's tied to trying to get systems to behave in more equitable and just ways?
Wondering
go
from
first?
Ryan Kim.
Yeah.
Should start, yeah.
On like in my perspective, I feel as if like we all like we create these like processes for these participants. We create these things. We create these spaces. We create these network experience, etc. And when we think about it, what are we doing it for, right? We're doing it for the young people. We're doing it for to better the world in 2042. We're doing it for,
Yeah.
et cetera, right?
Yeah. 7 generations.
What I see that we fall short at is, or what we have an issue at is the competition amongst like organizations, trying to get that one goal or set that one goal, and we have different organizations that do different things. So it kind of dilutes the work and it dilutes where the priority should be, right? So when we reach out, sometimes we don't know who we should be reaching out. So instead of having a mapping session and say, well, first we need to do this, then we need to do this, and then we need to do that, we say, well, that's hard. So we're not, so a lot of work is like really, I just feel like a lot of work is really diluted based on the directions of funds, based off, like innovation is suppressed, incubation is suppressed. We only focus a lot on like getting the systems to change the way that they work, right? That's very important. But if we don't top-down approach, we put the same amount of energy that we're putting on Capitol Hill in the grounds and in the grassroots movements, like it doesn't make sense to me if we don't do both at the same time. So I feel like we can strengthen our message, our narrative. We can strengthen what we're doing if we come together more in an intentional way and stop trying to, well, we have to focus on this one thing. If it's a holistic approach, there's no way we can focus on one thing at a time, because when you focus on this one thing, the next thing falls. Then you come over here and the next thing falls. So I just encourage the crowd to use the expertise to think in that way.
Wow, and cross systems change. I see that the work is really tough, because often these leaders who lead these different systems aren't all on the same page, like Ryan shared. But I think my hope and why I continue to grind hard, and I know the reason why a lot of us grind hard, is that we still got to act and we still got to move. And we still have to influence these leaders. Some of these folks are our champions, and they're moving much faster than other leaders in the system, and these that are leading these different systems. But that doesn't mean we lose hope in the ones who aren't moving fast or putting much effort into the work that we're trying to get done. What we just do is really just have patience. And it's really simple, y'all. I say it so simply because it is. You have to have patience with people. Sometimes some people in this work, they get it right now. It's urgent. Our young people, they're missing opportunities. Their lives are being disrupted by not having access to some of these spaces. And some folks, they don't see that sense of urgency. Sometimes they're very disconnected from the work, although they may be leading, because they're just focused on getting these tasks done. And they don't see that sense of urgency. So I try to have patience with folks when it comes to this cross-systems work. And I know one thing for sure, when it comes to the young leaders, we don't try to force folks to work with systems leaders that they may not be ready to engage with. We try to go after our interests. You got folks who are interested in policy, who want to work in government. So we try to ensure that these young people feel like they're ready or prepared enough to have that courage to have conversation, because that's where it all starts. It is that dialogue, and it goes down to that understanding. With more understanding, less judgment, and clarity, so we can start to put our best efforts forward to make change for young people.
Thank you, Kim.
So I'm not familiar with all of the work that the people in the room do. So ignore whatever I say that you're like, we knew that already. So we have done a lot of work that, number one, is intergenerational work. And one of the things that I think is, just the most important thing, which is like really simple, is listening. It's hard for elders to listen to youngins because they're like, what do you know, right? And I think there's also another problem in it, which is paternalism. We are a society that lives and thrives off of paternalism. The whole idea that I can save you because you can't save yourself. You don't know, I know, let me handle this for you. Too often we get caught in that trick bag, which then doesn't allow us to hear the simple messages that are standing before us. Also, that also means that there are some times where we take up issues like the priorities. We take up priorities that we want to set, not what the people in the movement or on the ground want to set, right? So for us, for example, Advancement Project, we have this weird thing about like our programs. Often our programs are really set by movement. It's hard to plan, right? But what we know is we can't engage with people on things that they're like, that's not the thing for us right now. My first case that I did, piece of litigation, it was an old school desegregation case. I was 30 years old, I'm out there like, hey, there's a new issue. And the community was like, first of all, that case still exists? And I was like, yeah, and I'm the new lawyer. They're like, okay, we don't actually care about that. What we care about is that we don't have running water.
That's right.
And I was like, wow, whoa. This is like South, my first time to the South. I was like, oh, wow, no running water. And I was like, well, but I can't help you with that because I came here to do this school desegregation case. And so do you think I had support in the courtroom? No, because people were like, that's not what we care about right now, right? And so I think being able to use the entry points about where the energy is, where the movement space is, where the opportunities are to engage people is really is key. And then I think just doing, we have done work with like school districts and young people and us all at the same table, police departments. We have so a lot of our school to prison pipeline work, we've been doing these kind of like bringing all the players together. Judges and all this kind of stuff, right? Police, et cetera. Having conversations and working towards some joint solutions on things. One of the important things is, so in Denver, where we work with a group called Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, one of the things that they've done now is this is a community that could not even get information from the school district. But because of organizing, just straight up old time organizing, and the work that we did with them, presenting back the information to young people and then presenting it back to the school district, the young people have quarterly report cards for the school district. And they stand up and they make a presentation and they say, here's where you're doing, this is where you're failing, et cetera. And the school district folks have to just sit and listen. Just sit and listen for an hour, right? But it's not just sit and listen, because at the end of that hour, they expect that there's going to be some discussion about how we're going to change to getting a grade A. And so being able to actually have young people have the stage, set the process also, because if you set the wrong process, you're going to have the wrong results at the end. And so if the process isn't the way that we want to mirror in society and the kind of outcomes that we want to see, it's the wrong process. And so we've got to be very intentional about those things.
Thank you, Judith.
So all of what you're talking about makes me think about this idea that this idea of having patience, listening hard, and being open to taking risk. It makes me all think of this idea of moving at the speed of the folks that are being organized, right? You move at their speed. You don't move at your speed.
That's right.
You move at their speed. And in that, what becomes clear in that process, and this ties back to Dr. G's work this morning and tying it up to this notion of justice. Like healing is the result of a process that's oriented towards justice, right? Justice is the recognition of the harm that's been done, and healing is the process of making folks whole. That's the process of justice, right? So if we are in a process with folks as organizers, right, as artists, as folks who are collaborating, who are deeply concerned with folks, then we need to be moving at their speed, and we need to be listening hard for recognizing who are the folks who are feeling it the most. And those people always need to be centered in what it is that we do. And then I also think, too, about, in this cross-system stuff, about the metaphor of the ecosystem, that we are trying to create, we're not trying to, in some ways, we're not trying to create little reforms that fix the system as it is. We're trying to create systems of being and wellness that interlock with each other and transform us individually and transform society as a whole. So we're building ecosystems because we need to be interdependent with each other, right? We need folks who are going to go big. We need folks who are comfortable with being small. We need folks who are making sure that there's maintenance, right? That all of the plants in the ecosystem are getting water. We're getting funds for this type of stuff. And then we need folks who are going to be taking risks, right? We have folks who and we're all interdependent upon each other in that regard. We're building an ecosystem. A lot of times I'm coming from 7 years in higher education. They talk about pipelines. So you build a pipeline to get underrepresented folks into leadership, and then everything is great, right? And the big question I have is, after 25 years of pipelines, why is the situation still the same, right? And it's because if you look at the metaphor, it's because all of us that are being put through the pipelines become refined drops of oil, right? And then we get put into this pipeline, and the pipeline takes us all the way very far from where we originated, right? Sometimes across rivers where we could potentially become a pollutant, right? And then we get dropped off at the other side of this pipeline in a barrel, and the barrel gets shipped off somewhere, and we end up burnt out in somebody's gas-guzzling car. So I'm just saying, as a pipeline metaphor, right? This is just a fix, and eventually that pipeline is going to draw leaks, and it's going to end up in a situation that doesn't improve anything. So if we're looking at building ecosystems, and this is like...
And it gets replaced by solar panels anyway.
We moved to renewable energies. Oh, wow. Okay, I'm going to have to think about it. I can mess with metaphors all day. But I just think, the work that we're doing is really about linking the local to the broad social thing, right? These are a lot of the ideas that Grace Lee Boggs and a number of other folks, Ella Baker, all these other types of folks thought about. We're in a rush to scale, right? But how does what's happening in our neighborhoods and our localities relate to what is the change that we really want to see? And that's sort of this idea of building ecosystems that can then interlock and transform systems. So,
Ryan, I see you nodding your head over there.
Yeah, he's in my head. I'm just every time he talk, I look at the screen. I know y'all probably think I'm reading the teleprompter. It just says, "We're gonna be all right."
Right.
Building
Come
hope.
right on back, right?
Building hope.
That's right.
Speaking in existence, right?
That's by the way, that's my cell phone ringer for my work cell phone is "We gonna be all right."
Yeah.
Just, it just gives me that, there's a T-shirt that I don't know if folks have seen that says, "I've been to the future and we won." Like sit with that, right?
Yes.
Sit with that one.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
I'm just sitting here thinking about the comment you made about the different levels, right? A lot of times we approach it at one level. We have to get them ready. We have to do a boot camp so they can be prepared for the job. Well, how about start with the people who prepared and let it trickle down like dominoes, right? Peer-to-peer interaction. I'll bring you with me. Like that's how it works. And I thought about Meek Mill's, one of my favorite rappers, and there's levels to everything, right? And there's levels to this as well. And I think about the culture comments. I just recently said in the breakout session with, I forgot the name of it, but Brazil, people was kind of teaching us the importance of being aware of your whole self, right? Mentally, physically, incorporating dance and all of those different techniques into like self-care, right? And the first thing I thought about was, well, before I thought about it, I have three other people here a couple people here from New Orleans, but 2 other young leaders from New Orleans that mentioned in that session that, our young people are different. Our young people start from this spot. They're kind of tough. We got hard shells. So we always have to kind of modify whatever product that we get and bring it back, right? So it's levels. I mean, it's levels to everything. And I think if iron sharpen iron, I get this from Jamil. Jamil says this all the time. If we utilize and maximize the potential that we keep talking about in this room, with the people in this room, right? And this is a cross-collaborative thing, right? Meaning we work with other people. It's like a spider web, right? That's where it starts. We go back into the community. A lot of times in New Orleans, we have people from all over the world, right? They mean well, intentions versus impact. Okay. You can't train or teach me my culture. So it's like incorporating that culture in is like so important and left out because of so many different reasons, right?
And I want to pick up on your point about the hard shell, and to your point about difference, right? Like, when are we going to start, like, knowing the beauty of difference? The beauty of it, right? Instead of, like, trying to ostracize it, othering it, all of the things that we have done as a society for so long, right? Like, the hardness of someone who grew up in New Orleans, like, I did a lot of work after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and like it is my second home, just in my heart, because the culture is incredible, right? But there are people who want to come and change that whole thing so that the second lines, you got to have a permit for a second
Right.
line. What?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and it's just, the Indians are like, the culture is beautiful, but what we try and do is homogenize it, and we're homogenizing it for the safety of white folks. And so that we can see ourselves as like this society that was built by white folks, and that's where the beauty is. We're trying to be that, right? Like always running to be like that, when that's not who we are. And actually the thing that we bring is the difference. And it's the thing that actually gives us a little flavor in this country, right? And so we need to start figuring out how the difference can be not only embraced, but centered and lifted up.
Kim, anything you want to add to that?
Wow, folks were. It's always an honor to be next to my brother because we busted up beyond just being on these stages together and stuff like that. We could spend like many nights really learning about each other's culture, and I think that's the importance of when we get the opportunity to unite young people across the nation is they have the opportunity to share their culture, where they come from, how they see the issues that they face, and how they address these issues. And the fact that embracing the difference is really important. I mean, we do it, and it's sad, we embrace the culture for monetary benefits. Certain people's cultures, people only embrace it when it brings them money. And it's sad that you have people who come into other places and just assume, when you go to New Orleans, like, it's raw, it's real. The people have strength. And when you learn the history and you start to understand, you don't try to come up there and try to shape their culture. That's for those folks to say, how do we want our community transformed, and what parts of the culture do we want to touch upon? Is that something we consider as a flaw or not? No, it's culture. And if these groups of people feel like they're not doing anything wrong, they're not going to change their behavior. Because at the end of the day, they feel comfort in that. And that's what we should respect, is the comfort of being in your own skin, doing what you feel makes you happy. Rather if that's through dance, sometimes ratchet gossip. You know, like, I'm just being honest. Like, we have to understand where young people's culture is right now and how that is being translated. Sometimes we come in this space and it's like frowned upon. Young people listening to hip hop, young people dressing a certain way, having all these appearance biases, having tattoos, having jargon when we speak. That's our culture. You need help understanding, ask a question. You know, it's a matter of clarity. We can tell you what keeping it 100 means to, you know, like, in our culture, in Philly is John. John is anything. You know, honestly, if you meet a Philly person, they'll tell you, like, it could be anything, and you can use it any way. And you can use it two times in one sentence, so it can become confusing. So it's like, what John are you referring to now? But just being quite honest, like, we have to learn how to really respect and love people for who they are. And respect the growth. That's not who I'm always going to be, too. As I continue to explore and learn other things, I'm growing. I can show you other things if I'm shown other things. And that's the key part, is if we have this privilege to really showcase people and create experiences and things like that for other people, then we should, well, for us. That's what it's all about. Like, when we come up here, it's not for other people, it's for us. Like I tell folks, like, opportunity youth, opportunity adult, this is my family and friends. We do go back into the trenches.
That's right.
We see young people, you know, going through these crazy, like, the drug abuse culture right now. You know, you listen to music, you hear the conditions people really face, and that's throughout music history, rather if that's just with sound and instrument or with actual words. You know, these are people talking about their conditions, their realities. So why is it being translated as if someone wants to be a thug, a criminal? Like, that's not what it is. You have to really, that's why it's important that it's great to be in Aspen, it's great to be in your own community too, but go into them trenches. Go into where it's really hard at. And then you'll see that sense of urgency of why that young person always up in your face, why they need to be here, even if you don't got the slot for them.
Yes.
You know, like,
right.
we need to really start to like, when we see the realities, we never going to be able to walk in that person's shoes. I don't care how much of their story they tell you, you're not going to be able to walk in that person's shoes.
That's right.
Like, we all have different dynamics when it comes to family, life, relationship, and all those other things that's involved in life, you know. I just really, truly want to respect, you know, the fact of what my friends and family have set up here is, you know, just really embracing that difference. Like, when we come in here, and I think when I used to think of the Aspen Institute, you do think of an elite space and a predominantly white space.
Say it.
And then when you come here for the OY, it's like, boom, we brought a whole lot of color to this community. And they don't know how to handle it sometimes. You can tell. Listen, you'll hear the encounters people have if they share with you. Like, it's a pretty different type of experience. This is a utopia that doesn't really exist here in our America. You know, this is only here. This is here, a retreat place. I love Aspen. Don't get it wrong, but it's just not reality.
That's right.
You know, reality is, you have places like this. I think of Pennsylvania. I think of the justice system. How is the population being counted as 5,000, and about 3,000 of those folks are people who are incarcerated in that county? We're not talking about people who live here residentially. They're counting people who are justice involved, who are in these prisons, as folks who are part of the population. I'll leave it as that. I'm sorry, y'all.
That's okay. That's all right. That's all right. Well, you have said something that is really critical to pick up on, and we're going to. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that if any audience members have questions, that we have the opportunity to address them. So I'm going to ask you to at least prepare your questions while I do one final question for our guests. So, Kim, I want to pick up on this last point that you were just making, and I want to tie it back to something that Judith said, and also something that Dr. G said this morning. So Dr. G reminded us this morning that trauma comes out of policy. Trauma is, we experience trauma based on the historical policies that have impacted our people disproportionately. And then Judith, a moment ago, said to us that we have to be really clear about the outcomes. And our process has to be designed in a way that get us to the outcomes that we seek. And we know the history that she talked about in terms of dismantling the school to prison pipeline. We know that so many of our communities around the country are working on that. I mentioned in our talking points yesterday, in Oakland, they call it the prison to college pipeline. So really trying to reshape that narrative. The question that I'm curious to hear you both speak to, Ryan and Kim, is when you think about the work, either specifically of the National Council of Young Leaders, but also OYU, what are some of the tactical strategies that you are using to organize your peers? You guys have a set of policy recommendations that you have said that are not only about anti-poverty, but that are about the vision you hold for the way you want the country to embrace your peers. Can you walk us through the policy agenda and what you want us as adults to support you in as you carry that policy agenda out?
I could start since it's not much for us, right? So I started off with saying, how different we are. So our first step is learning policy, understanding what policy is, how it affects our everyday life, et cetera. So we're in the process of working with GFF. They're creating a policy and advocacy training internally with myself, with OYU and Employ Cowan Institute, which is my home base in New Orleans. Which is the collaborative that serves in New Orleans, but I kind of lost my train of thought just that fast. Catch me up.
So the policy doing.
I think, like I say, everything starts with foundation. The foundation is they have to understand what policy is, what they can do about it, what's the ramifications. So I think providing that training, those workshops, and preparing them to understand what that looks like and how they can activate. And then on the side of that, just organizing and making sure that they are a part of each and every conversation. So even the things that they don't know about policy, they know the work that we're doing. They know where we're trying to go. They know how we're trying to get there, right? Just speaking on OYU specifically, we've created community action teams, local community action teams, thinking about the foundation of our work, the recommendations that we created in 2012. We kind of mobilized the voter engagement piece of it, the civic engagement piece of it. So we've been like heavy on civic engagement. We've been mobilizing our young people. We've worked with Circle. We mobilize our young people to do a survey in the community, find out to really drive in the importance of voting. But like I said, we have to first figure out how it relates to our everyday life. So it's a couple concrete things and like follow-ups. I can give you a million concrete things that we do, but that's the more systematic kind of bigger approaches.
Well, I'll speak to some of the work that we do. It's kind of complex because you really learn by really kind of walking with us. There's a lot that the Council and Opportunity Youth United does. I think I'll share basically the idea of the Council. They have developed a policy platform, and there's 6 recommendations that they believe in. We kept it very general because this is a national policy platform. It's not local. So we have to create a policy platform that accommodates all our folks, something that we want universally for all groups of people, right? It does not matter if you're opportunity youth or a young person, you need to have access to mentorship. You need comprehensive programs. We need the re-entry programs and things like that for our folks who are coming out of these justice systems and things like that. We kept our policy platform generic. With the Opportunity Youth United movement, the strategy is the Council secures the bag. That's what we often say, right? We're meeting with different folks to try to get some money to really put it back into community, because that's who needs it, right? And what we do is leverage our national network and platform to highlight the work that is happening in local communities, because sometimes there is a disconnect being in national spaces. We often just hear the national stuff. So really it's about getting grassroots and backgrounded in the community and, leveraging our responsibility with securing that bag and bringing it back to the community. Young people can't just organize with no resources. That's just the reality of it. Like, they need capital, they need space, they need money, they need to be valued for their input, their time and energy. Like, it's 2018. Who's really doing free organizing out here now? I'm just being quite honest. Like, there's so many avenues and grants and things you can apply for and ways you can frame this language that we can provide that support to our young people back home. So that's how Opportunity Youth United is doing. Basically, the council is out here going hard trying to secure the bag because we know how to work with our we have been working with these different stakeholders in these different spaces, so we know the language that kind of gets them sparked, and we know the stories that we need to tell and how to frame these narratives to secure the bag for our people, because that's what it's all about. It ain't just about the council. It's about the community action teams, because that opportunity in itself, exposing young people to civic engagement beyond just voting, beyond just showing up with your elected official. What is community beautification? What is value? You matter, your community matters, and the only way you're not going to matter is when you don't show up into these spaces where they feel like you don't matter. But when you start to show up in these spaces where you show them that you matter, rather if you don't say nothing at all or you're just there, they know that you care, and you're not going to, the resistance is real. We're not going to give up, you know, even if you don't feel like working with us.
Thank you. All right. So we love to take some questions from the audience. Mike, right in the back. Thank you. We have a mic coming.
Okay. I thought everyone's comments was great. The panel was awesome, but my question is for Kimberly. I wrote it down like Monique said. So Kimberly, you mentioned that where a young person is today doesn't mean that they'll be in that place or that space later. What advice would you give to adults, especially folks in this room, who sometimes might get caught up in that place where a young person could be versus meeting them where they are? So any advice or tips you might give to the folks in the room?
I believe people are very smart, which we all know that, and we develop. We have stages of life, and I know folks study this who work with youth or people. You know, humans develop, and we're not always going to be doing the same thing. So what I would share for folks in this room is, like I shared early on this panel, is to have patience with a person, like you have patience with your family. And when you start to look at a young person beyond just, when you have a relationship with somebody, you either friend or you family, and often friends are family. And when you start to view people as friends and family, you go harder for them than just somebody you coming to work for. And that's how sometimes we have to transition the way we looking at this. It's like you're transforming lives. You're not just transforming a moment for a person. This moment creates impact, right? You can treat me real negative, and I can either thrive off that and go hard and say, you know what, all adults not like that. And I'm gonna still respect y'all. Or I can be put in the shell or cornered in a place where I feel like, y'all not for me. I don't need your help. So we have to recognize this experience and these day-to-day actions that we have on people and how they impact them. Like, start viewing our young people as family. And family, listen, you love some people from a distance, and you just love some people, you know, all the time. You want to, you know, you got your cousins or whoever you're close to all the time. So just recognizing, like, sometimes you might love that young person from a distance because you just cannot deal with their actions right now. But find that understanding and why they're acting like that. And don't view it as something wrong. View it as like they're human and they're going through something. You know, so have patience with them.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. So I think we are almost out of time. We had just one more. No, please, this is our final question. Thank you.
So my question is also for Kim. Kim, you mentioned in the breakout session with Jeff, how do we hold our institutions responsible? You asked that as a question, and I want to pose it to you. As a youth leader in this work, how do we hold our institutions responsible? So for public education, juvenile justice, foster care.
Can we, if I do a friendly amendment, make that a closing sort of parting wisdom across all of our guests as well?
That would be awesome.
Thank you so much.
Please.
I'm a firm believer that we govern these institutions, so we need to start leading on them.
I let the people who focus on institutions and policies focus on that, and I focus on the young people.
organize, organize, organize. And, building power, like in the work that we do, for example, my team knows if it ain't about power, if we're not building power in communities of color, then we shouldn't be doing it. Because that's where it starts. And then political education, right? Like people, giving people the context and connecting the dots. So then we can go hold systems accountable, whether it's through pushing through voting or, voting is not the only thing. That's what we also have to make sure people understand. Voting is one day, right, of accountability, right? But it is not the beginning and the end. Undocumented people can't vote, but they got power, right? And they got to, and they're holding some stuff accountable across the country, right? And so the organized part has got to happen every day beyond the voting day.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to that is that it's political organizing and it's also cultural organizing too, right? So it's just to rephrase what you're saying about elections, what we like to say is politics is where some of the people are at some of the time, but culture is where most of the people are at most of the time. And so I would just say that it's about organizing cultures of let's say ownership. Why don't we say ownership? Yeah.
Right.
That this is our government, that these are our institutions, that these are going to be made to serve us, and that we're going to be building the cultures that actually transform all of these different types of levels, going back to levels of things, from the very small to the very large. So.
Culture to transform systems across multiple levels. I think that is the perfect place to close. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Join me in thanking Monique Miles for her leadership of this network. Thank you to the whole Aspen team. Really, you guys are extraordinary. Thank you to Aspen Conference Services, everybody who works for the Institute, for the whole space. It's been incredible. Thank you, guys. Thank you, team. Amazing team. I'll just close us out with recognizing what I think Jeff kind of led with, which is the sort of painful, paradoxical moment that we are in right now. He articulated it with a book, We Gon Be Alright, and an election that didn't quite say the same thing. We saw that 2042, I remember Angela Glover Blackwell kind of learning me up at one point when I was like, oh, demographics is destiny. Once the people of color take over, we gonna be all right. I don't think I put it that way to Angela. And she said, not necessarily. And we know 2042 came a long time ago in South Africa, right? So we know that unless we are doing this work, we ain't gonna be all right. And the paradox of culture change that's coming, that Judith spoke to and Sean spoke to and Dan Porterfield spoke to, but at the same time that the dominant toxic culture feels like it's gained momentum, and that's a tough paradoxical moment to live in. The healing central paradigm shift that we heard about and the rise in hate that we witness in our dominant culture. The paradox of wisdom versus tweets filled with hate and Fox News and fake news, which is all the same stuff to me. Pipelines and ecosystems, what an interesting, and thank you for taking a metaphor even further than I took the metaphor of the aspens, Jeff. That was really helpful for me as therapy. The paradox of talking about equity and justice in Aspen, Colorado, really? Gotta live with it, gotta name it. I love the way Kimberly named it. One time I submitted our director's report where every quarter I have to report on how we worked on equity, and I just said, we had more people of color in the J bar in the history of the J bar. That was sent it into my boss. True story. So I guess so, naming the paradox is important because we know we're on the right side of those divides. And that can be a lonely place. And that can be a really hard place and one that brings up so much emotion. And I appreciated how much emphasis we had on healing at this gathering, and I hope we'll carry that with us. But it is also paradoxical with Emmett Till's mom saying, "I do not have a minute to waste." And how do you balance those? And I know we will be working hard in the months and years ahead. And I also appreciated Jeff bringing up the Kendrick tune for which his book is named, because that song begins with "all my life I had to fight." And so that's part of that paradox, because we're going to have to fight for the young people with the young people, help them fight in a way that keeps them safe and whole. So as we go forward, what the hell are we supposed to do? And I guess what I would say is, if you'll indulge me, be those aspens, have those shared roots. I can't wait to hear about somebody getting on a subway and saying, "I'm an aspen. I'm here to make sure you aren't messing with the young people," or whatever it is. But stay connected. Better yet, be the plants that Sean introduced us to. What a fascinating experiment, putting multiple plants together in a toxic space, having them transform that space into a healthy space while they stayed healthy themselves. That's what we need to do going forward as we think about really shifting the whole ecology for the young people in our country. And so that's our charge going forward. I hope that you are feeling that paradox of being so full from this good feeling, these good people, you good people, and also still so hungry, right? We're hungry for justice, for what's right. So come back in May when we go to Philly in the house. Stay in touch, grow the stand, take care of yourselves, and we will see you in Philadelphia in May. Thanks, everybody.